Good afternoon or good evening, wherever you may be listening to us from here on this big, beautiful planet we call Earth. This is Michael Cross here with another edition of Unlock the Door Radio here on UCY TV Productions. And I think we're going to have a very interesting show in store right now. First, before we begin, I'd like to make a plug for, if you're listening to this later on YouTube, go ahead and subscribe to the channel, because then you'll be able to keep up with shows coming in the future, and also be able to see some of our past shows, interviews with guests and so forth, that you'll find quite intellectually stimulating. And if you're into psychology, mind control, manipulation by the media, psychopathy, there's plenty in there, okay? So just browse through my channel. Also, check out my latest science fiction book, The Destiny of Our Past. You can find that on Amazon. If you've ever wondered, what could the era of Noah have actually looked like? And not, maybe some artist rendition from the Renaissance era that you might have seen back in Sunday school. Anyway, check it out. I think you'll like it. Anyway, on with the show, as they used to say. Okay, this week, you may be listening to this later, it might not be this, but this week, Charles Manson died. I know, a lot of people were feeling really bad about that, I am sure. Actually, there are probably a few people that felt really bad about it. Most people I noticed in social media were pretty, just pretty upset that he hadn't been executed back in the time period where he actually committed all these crimes. And what I posed the question on one of the social media platforms and got lots and lots of responses. And I said, or I should say asked, what would Charles Manson have been like had he been born just exactly the way he was genetically, with the same talents, the same personality, and so forth? What if he'd been born into a family of bankers, a family of politicians, corporate CEO, maybe a corporate CEO as his father, any number of these kinds of opportunities, where if we assume that much of what goes into a psychopath, which of course Charles Manson, it seems there's a pretty good consensus that Charles Manson was a psychopath. If it is a genetic thing, then what would he have been like? And the responses I received, which I'm going to go into, were everything as to, boy, he probably would have been one of the top TV anchors or something, an actor. A few people responded, might have wound up being Pope if he was born into a Catholic family. Clergy is actually one of the 10 most common occupations that you will find psychopaths behind, such things as surgeons, emergency room doctors, politicians, entertainers, journalists, police, and anyway, there are a couple more there. So let's just assume that Charlie would have been born, instead of the impoverished background he was, one in which he didn't really get a lot of opportunities, and he eventually turned to petty crime. What if he had actually instead been able to master those personality traits, much like I've seen some figures that up to like almost a quarter of CEOs might be psychopaths. What what if he'd been able to master those traits, become a more high-functioning psychopath? And he could have, and this is what I believe, though, beyond anything that anything else that was mentioned, is that Charles Manson could easily have wound up being in the United States Senate. In fact, he might today, if we assume, people probably take better care of themselves when they're free versus sitting in a jail cell for the past 40 years. If he had been free and grew up in California, he might be the one of the two United States senators from California today. I mean, there's plenty of elderly senators and congressmen, and he might very well have made it. And when you think about that, when you think about the fact that traits that are associated with psychopathy can also be associated with Charles Manson, can also be associated with politicians, then it really causes things to make sense. When politicians do the things they do, when Hollywood people do the things they do, when we get on the headlines now about sexual harassment, rape, all kinds of other things, and you're going, wait a minute, these people are really rich, and so forth. Why do they resort to this kind of behavior that we normally associate with maybe the kind of background? I mean, I'm just saying the way we associate it with the kind of background that Charles Manson came from. Well, it could be that their control over their impulses might not be as great as we think. And many of these people we see in the headlines today, they're getting in trouble for that, and as well as many other things, or getting us into wars, or pushing wars, or taking away freedoms. Could very well be psychopaths. So anyway, let's take a look at something here. Now, I've cited this before in some of my when I've been interviewed actually by other radio stations, and that is an article that was in the June 15th, 2009. It says top of the ticket political commentary from the LA Times, Los Angeles Times, and the title is politicians share personality traits with serial killers, colon study. And it goes into this idea that, and I really encourage people to read this. It goes into the idea that we look at these serial killers. I'm not talking about the kind you see on TV. I mean, often those are cartoon characterizations and so forth, if you've ever actually studied these kinds of people. But if you take a look at what they have in common with politicians, I like this comment here. It says, yep, violent homicide aside, our elected officials often show many of the exact same character traits as criminal nut jobs who run from police but not for office. And he goes on to say, Corey notes that these criminals are psychologically capable of committing their dirty deeds free of any concern for social, moral, or legal consequences, with absolutely no remorse. This allows them to do what they want, whenever they want, he wrote. Ironically, these same traits exist in men and women who are drawn to high-profile and powerful positions in society, including political office holders. Did you catch that? The traits that we could associate with not really having great impulse control, that need for speed, and I don't mean that in reference to either, well, it could be driving cars fast, but it's a need to be doing what you want, but not worrying about the consequences so much. Oh, you might think, well, I don't want to get caught. I mean, I don't want to get into kind of this cartoon characterization of these kinds of people, these psychopaths, that you see on TV. But often the thinking about what could happen happens after the act itself has been conceived and conducted. Okay? So, the other really big difference between, should I say, neuronormative people, just regular everyday Joes and Janes, and psychopathic people is, because obviously most people that commit crimes or do bad things to people are not psychopaths in the psychological sense, but just doing stupid things does not mean you're a psychopath. But the idea of no concern for social, moral, or legal consequences, and with absolutely no remorse. Someone asked me today, I was in a conversation with them, and they asked me, they brought this up. They said, what's the difference between a narcissist and a psychopath? Because they were talking about political leaders. And I said, the big difference between a psychopath and a narcissist is the narcissist still cares what people think about them. They have many of the same traits that overlap with each other. And we've talked about this in previous shows. I'll probably deal with this again. But they have many of the same traits that overlap with each other. But one difference, and I think it's the primary difference, is that the narcissist cares about their public image. The psychopath doesn't. So they might get into the same kind of trouble. They might get into the same problems because of, and I'll go into this in just a minute here about some of the traits. They might all possess a sense of, for instance, lack of empathy. But even though a narcissist can pull, let's say a narcissist develops this wonderful sales campaign, and a lot of people buy. Let's talk about the banking system and so forth. Back in 2008, and let's say some of these hedge fund leaders and bankers and so forth, they're really able to get out there and just load up the people into these systems, and they know that it's probably not a good idea, but they just can't resist because they're competing with other people, and they want to have the most, and they want to make the most money, and then all of a sudden it collapses, and maybe their name's in the newspaper. And I'm not going to name any names, but just to say the guy's names or the woman's names in the newspaper for all the misery they caused because the system collapsed, and let's say a lot of people lost their money. In reality, the psychopath is more likely to be like, sucks to be them. I mean, it's just like, well, buyer beware. It's not my fault. Don't blame me. The narcissist, on the other hand, who displays many of the same characteristics I'm going to go into, they, on the other hand, might feel like, oh no, now the media is making me look bad. They're saying how horrible I was, how I should have known better, and they're saying I have no conscience. And that actually bothers them. Because the narcissist puts that persona out there that really they depend upon as their, what you could say, their battery that keeps them going. And, I think it's safe to say that if we lowered the scale for what we consider psychopaths and narcissists, to perhaps include borderline psychopaths and narcissists, people that, I'm just saying this for instance, when you talk about one of the initial things is these tests that you take, that a score of 0 means you're at absolutely no psychopathy, and 40 is like, oh my gosh, you're a psychopath. Usually it's around, depending on the country, 25 or 30 points on this, then you're a psychopath. Now, the thing is, what do you do about the people that are like a number 20 or 23? So, I think many of these people that do get elected to office I think that they're in those like 20 and above. I think it's quite rare, and I may be wrong about this, okay? I'm just saying, I think that it would be quite rare to have a successful politician that would score 0 to 10. I don't think they would have the cunning, the ruthlessness, the competitive drive, the basically that sense of what life is all about is to win. I don't think they would have that. Now, Charles Manson. Let's take a look at Charles. He started out very petty, in and out of jail, crime, small crimes. Later, when he's in California, he had read some Dale Carnegie stuff. How to Win Friends and Influence People. It's an old book. I've actually only seen little pieces of it, but I'm kind of intrigued now that I've heard about what Manson did. And maybe I'll pick it up and see what it's all about. I think it was really popular back in the 70s. Well, anyway, and earlier. There was a chapter when he was in prison for some other crime than what we think of him in prison for. There was a chapter that he was supposed to have really focused on that dealt with how to get someone to buy into the concept of ownership of an idea. Okay? Now, psychopaths are very good at this. They want you to do something. Now, let's say you have. I'm going to come up with a weird situation here, but let's say you've got a husband, and he really, really, really wants to try a threesome. Okay, now I told you it's going to be weird. Well, he really wants to try a threesome. He kind of brings it up subtly to his wife. Oh, that could be kind of fun. The wife is like, oh my gosh, how could you even suggest such a thing? I would never do something like that. And then he might say something. Now, I'm assuming that, let's say he's psychopathic too. And he might say, well, yeah, I know, it would be terrible. I mean, I've heard it could be fun. I mean, but it would be a really horrible thing to, for someone to do. It would be just totally against morality. And the wife's going, well, yeah, I mean, I could see where it could be fun, in a physical sense, and it would be interesting. And then after she said that, because I don't know what the chapter says, but I know how psychopaths deal with these kinds of things, so how they could twist this. Because then the husband can go, yeah, I think you're right, about this, that it could be fun. I mean, and then starts twisting it around to make it sound like, maybe you've got a point there. Maybe we should look into it. It might be kind of fun to even just think about. And so now he's shifted it from, something that's just repugnant to the wife to where he's starting to kind of use a neuro-linguistic programming technique where she's starting to go, yeah, I don't know why I suggested to my husband that we should try a threesome. You see, this is how this kind of stuff works. This is how psychopaths work very well. A psychopath can seduce someone who might be his best friend's wife, and then in the morning be saying, oh, man, now I feel kind of bad that I let you seduce me. And the woman's kind of going, but, and he's going, yeah, I mean, I'm honored that you feel this way about me and such, but I think we should try to keep it a little under wraps because I really do respect, her husband. And he can convince her. It's a form of gaslighting, but I'm not going to go into that so much. I've heard a lot of people use the term, and some of them know what it means and some of them don't. But he can twist it around to where now she believes she's the one that came up with the whole idea in the first place. Charles Manson was a genius at this. From what I understood from a documentary I saw about him, he could go into a college cafeteria, and one of the signs of psychopathy is having a grandiose image of yourself. And I think Charles Manson could probably fit into what's known as cerebral psychopaths. People that are like, they're just so obsessed with their brain power, their superiority. And whether he was a genius or not, I don't know. A lot of people say he was a criminal genius. I've never seen a test done to see what his IQ is. But he believed it. I'm pretty sure he believed it. So therefore, he goes in, and remember, grandiose. I looked it up. He was a very short man. He was like, what was it, 5'2"? That's pretty short. All right, that's like Napoleon short. So here's this guy. He has no college degree. He's short. He could walk into a cafeteria, from my understanding, and he sees a woman. And in his mind, he was very good at hunting a prey, so to speak. He sees her, starts talking with her. At some point in the conversation, she agrees to come and check out his quote-unquote family, his followers. And then he used some really interesting mind control techniques, in which he finds out what are things that totally would turn, the things that she would find repugnant. I would never do this. And then at some point he'd convince her to do it, not just with him, but in front of the group. So now her ego is subjected to kind of a questioning and shattering, so to speak. And who does she rely on then for her support and comfort, since her inner ego has been jeopardized here? It's going to be the other members of the group. Now, it was quite effective. Most of his followers did not kill anyone. Some did. Charles Manson, from my understanding, or at least what the press says, never actually killed someone himself. He had other people do it. And he had these ideas, again, going into the grandiose ideas, that he had an idea that if he was doing these killings, it would create a race war that would engulf the world, that then it was something about whites would lose, and then the non-whites wouldn't be able to really govern themselves, so they would turn to his followers to establish this hierarchy, this top of the pyramid organization that would rule the world. Now, whether that was just something that he fancifully said, or whether he really believed it, who knows? But the thing is, that is one of the traits that is often associated with politicians. Often young politicians young people who say, I'm going to be president someday, or I'm going to be a U.S. senator, and they're like 10 years old. Whereas their friends are going, I want to be a baseball star, or I want to be a this or this or this, and they're going, I want to be a senator or congressman. Usually it's senator, but president, whatever. There is this sense of drive. And think about Manson's control over people's minds. Think of what he could have accomplished running for office. Because I tend to be of the belief that charisma is not something that you can develop really on your own. You've either got it or you don't. You either have the ability to project your personality out, the ability which is associated with it to get people to not only follow you but believe that they're following themselves. They convince themselves the reason they're following you is because it's in their best self-interest to follow you. That's charisma. And I seriously don't think you can really train it if a person doesn't have some sort of, charisma gene. You can get people to be more assertive, speak in front of public audiences, but they're not going to have that same ability as someone who can get in front of 10,000 people and joke around as if they were sitting there with you at a coffee table and just goofing off. All right? You're not going to have that unless you are in some way born with it. And I think Manson was. All right. Now, some of the other traits that I think could have led Manson to becoming a very successful, I'll just say U.S. senator or something. The glib and superficial charm. Well, he could charm any. If he could charm people to do the most hideous things. I'm not just talking about going against their own moral compass. I'm talking about violating the norms of society. Now, even though psychopaths tend not to really care about the norms so much, most of them would not just think, oh, I could go kill someone. I don't think I'm going to do it. Okay, there is usually, even in psychopaths, there is a switch that comes on that would say, don't hurt this person. Manson could get people to turn that switch off. And I doubt if his followers were any different than the general population. There was a lot of young people, especially women in California at the time. It was a hippie movement, and it was just like I'm questioning society. And he grabbed onto this. He's certainly not the only one. I've met people, because I'm from Oregon. I've met people that are members of sex cults. All right, I talked to this one guy. Gave him a ride one time when he needed a ride. Seemed to be safe. He was quite old, maybe in his early 70s. And I mentioned, something about family, and he said, "Oh, I've got 11 kids." And I'm like, oh, really? And then, of course, he made the stipulation. Well, I'm not Mormon or I'm not Catholic, but I belong to this. And he started describing his group. And, it was a few men and a lot of women. And he had all these kids that he had made with this woman or this woman and that one and so forth. So there's, and you read about it even today. There's like these guys that form sex cults, and they send women that, maybe the first one or two, they're like, oh, I just adore everything about you. And then he'll say, oh, we should bring more people into our little group. And they go out and they start gathering, and pretty soon, you got this nice little flock of people that are following you. I have a friend. He said he went to a hot spring one time in Oregon, and he met someone like this. There was this elderly guy, and he had like 5 or 6 young women who were his adorers. Let's just put it that way. So usually, you have these like little cults and stuff. I've heard of women doing this. I know someone who said something about his son was, his girlfriend was somewhat associated with this one group of pagans. Not really pagan, witches. Okay, so, there's kind of a crossover, of course, between pagans and witches, but these women consider themselves witches. And it was women who were in control of these various groups. So it was kind of a, some of them were polyamorous, bisexual, but some of them were straight out lesbian. And maybe the woman that went into it did not initially think, oh, I want to be part of a lesbian cult, but within a little bit of mind control, exercise, voila, she's number 6 on the totem pole for this woman's affections. I mean, this is not uncommon, okay? These kinds of groups are not uncommon. But if you have the power over another individual to where you can get them to abandon all their goals in life, all of what they were brought up to believe, and to follow you, be it out into the desert of California or the mountains of Oregon or Tennessee. I was trying to find someone to be on a show to represent paganism one time, and I was communicating with this guy who, it was just this old guy who, who had one of these kinds of groups. So, some people are quite content to have a dozen or so totally dedicated followers, and some people want to have a country of followers. All right? I'm not saying all these gurus out there are psychopaths, but I would love to give them the test to see what they would score. But you need to have that superficial charm. It doesn't mean that you're great at small talk. In fact, actually, psychopaths are not very good at small talk. But that superficial charm, to make the person feel good when they're talking to you, and to leave themselves open and confess to you all these things that they believe and wish for and desire. And then you can just fill the void. Yes, I can help you get that. And pretty soon you're up in the, you're one of the followers. Of course, then again, when a politician does it, you don't just have a few followers, you got massive numbers of followers, and people are like, yay, and you go to speeches, and they're yay, and that's why sometimes I just wonder, why the freak do politicians do things that are illegal with the opposite sex? I mean, it seems like they would not have to resort to stupidity and crime like that. But then again, if they're, what we're talking about here, maybe they just can't help themselves. Okay, we've dealt with the superficial charm. Manson obviously had it. Grandiose self-worth, absolutely. Need for stimulation or proneness to boredom. Oh my gosh, poor guy, 40 years in prison. But I think he's someone that, at least you go by some of these interviews he's had, he seemed to be someone that wasn't content to just sit back and read a nice little book. Okay, so there, obviously he also was doing things so unusual, I think, that this fits. Pathological lying. Do we need to go more on that one? I mean, except for the fact that politicians often don't just flat out lie. They often know how to twist the truth. Okay? Kind of the, did not have sex with that woman, Monica Lewinsky. Or making comments about Saddam Hussein, and then talking about 9/11, and then going back to Saddam Hussein. You kind of get the idea that maybe that politician kind of could figure out that the audience is falsely believing Saddam Hussein had anything to do with the Twin Towers coming down. I mean, anyway, pathological line. Manipulative. Okay, do we need to say more? Politicians are extremely manipulative, or they wouldn't be where they're at. We've already dealt with Charles. A lack of remorse or guilt. He never said. I don't ever think Charles Manson ever said he was sorry for anything he did. Then again, how many politicians come up and confess their sorrow over getting the United States into some sort of senseless war, or something they've done that's caused a lot of people to lose their jobs and so forth. Shallow effect, hard to measure. Okay, it's the idea of kind of an interpersonal coldness, even though it seems like you're extremely gregarious and open and wonderful and the life of the party. Personally, you're kind of not someone who's cuddly, and people want to, they may want to give you the hug, but you're not necessarily wanting the hug. I don't know if you explain, if you understand what that means. Lack of empathy. Yeah, I think we can be pretty sure about that one. Parasitic lifestyle. Not sure how Manson made his money. Yeah, I've never actually researched that too much. Politicians, I do find it amazing how so many of our senators and other major politicians, you look at their salary and then you look at the homes they have, and you're wondering, how did they get that much money just being a public servant? You gotta wonder. Poor behavior controls. Often I think of these kinds of things, poor behavior controls are mitigated by the fact that if you come from a good family, you learn how to control what you do a little bit better than if you come from a family that's kind of in turmoil. You go to a good school, you learn what you can and can't do to still get the good grades. You go into politics, and you're going to have your campaign staff that, even though you might be somewhat reckless, they're going to be covering for you. Okay? they're going to be trying to cover for you, or they're going to try to keep you from harming yourself, so to speak. Manson never really had that. But had he grown up in a home that would have provided these things, maybe he would have. Promiscuous sexual behavior, well, just read up on Manson sometime. And you know, the group and so forth. But ultimately, this is one that I have some problems with. I don't know if really promiscuous sexual behavior should be there. Maybe potential for promiscuous behavior, because again, cerebral psychopaths sometimes are not even sexual, they're asexual. If they are sexual, they might only want to be with people that are of their pay scale, so to speak. You know, they're not going to lower themselves to just being with that person or that one or that one or that one or that one. They're not looking for having, you know, 10,000 partners during their life. They would find it repugnant. Again, I always have to do a plug that if you're listening to this later on YouTube, go ahead and hit the subscribe button so you can keep up on more recent shows, and also be able to explore some of the topics I have covered in the past, particularly interviews with people in reference to issues such as, well, everything from mind control to psychopathy. And also, please check out my book, The Destiny of Our Past. And you can find that on Amazon. If you're into dystopian literature that proposes that maybe the events that we may be facing in the future are tied to the events that happened thousands upon thousands of years ago. And a little hint, maybe it's not the way you read about it in your anthropology class. Anyway, let's just go ahead and continue here. Of course, we have to realize there's a lot more to the planet and what's going on than what we see on TV. The problem with television, though, okay? The problem with television is that that's where we wind up getting most of what we think we know. And that goes for conservatives, too. Okay? Now, of course, many who are listening to this go beyond that, and they research issues, and they usually know a lot more than the average person. But you know, the average person in America watches television 5 hours a day. Okay? It's a little bit more when you're older and less when you're younger, but it's still a lot when you're younger. And often statistics can show a false impression, because maybe you ask a young person, well, how much TV do you watch? And they say, well, I don't watch any. And then you say, oh, but do you stream stuff? Do you watch things on movie channels and series? That, you know, there's a whole bunch of ways you can watch TV series. And that's when they say, yeah. And then sometimes you'll get young people who will binge watch a TV show. They might want to catch up on, well, there's a whole bunch of shows out there. And, you know, the ones on cable, some of them are pretty good. But here's the problem, though. Now, I'm just going to throw this in. We should be a lot more discerning in what our young people watch. And I'm not saying, you know, every generation that's had TV has been like, oh, my kids are watching this, should I let them watch this? I'm sure that in the 1950s, those who had TVs were kind of like, I don't know, maybe the Rifleman or, you know, something like that is, and later Gunsmoke might be too violent for kids. Obviously, there was people that thought Tom and Jerry was too violent for children. I will note that Tom and Jerry was actually not, I mean, a lot of those cartoons were not particularly made with little children audiences in mind. Those played at theaters and so forth. Intermissions between movies, and and it brought people in because, this week we have a Roadrunner or we have a Tom and Jerry or something like that. Now, the thing, though, that I would really recommend people do is not so much get rid of television, because maybe you could. I mean, if you could do it, more power to you. I know families that have, and with very positive results. Now, that's anecdotal. It's just what I have seen. All right? I don't, know. There may be families out there that, kids went totally wild because they felt like they were deprived of TV. I don't know. But I am going to say this. We need to know more about what's going on TV. And here's what I mean by that. When I was in college, I didn't want to take literature. Ironic now that I've had all these books published and they're fiction. But I didn't want to take literature. And at the institution that I went to university at, you didn't have to if you took a couple of semesters of film literature. And often what film literature meant was film analysis. And that's when you learn everything. You learn camera angles. You learn how delivery is given. You learn basically all the subtle things that 99% of the time you never notice. Well, you learn how to notice it. Now, the problem with it, and I'll warn you about this, most series I see on TV, I can pretty much, if I turn it on, I can analyze it within 5 minutes. Who's going to be the villain? Who's going to be, how the story's going to turn out? Who's going to survive if it's if action movie or something? And you learn it through mostly learning how to tell the, like foreshadowing. It bugs my wife. For instance, there's one technique of foreshadowing where generally, since in Western culture we read and look at things from left to right. So when if you're watching a movie, and this is just one of those little subtle things, I'm going to go into more now. If suddenly the action switches from right to left, so if it's a horror movie and the cheerleader's out in the woods and she's running and it looks like she's going to get away, she starts to notice maybe a campsite later, further down, and everything, she's going to make it. But all of a sudden it switches to where it looks like she's running from right to left. Guy with the chainsaw is going to get her. I mean, because they throw that in to make you a little bit on edge. Because now you're watching from right to left movement. So, if I mention these kinds of things, my wife's like, oh, gee, she doesn't like to watch movies with me. If I do that, I have to be very quiet. But that's just one thing. One of the things that really bothers me is the way that conservative people, or basically the flyover people, are presented. And it's often very subtle. But everything in a movie, okay, anything that's, any kind of budget movie, I don't know about low budget movies, but anything that's a movie that is going to wind up on your television set is actually, they may take forever to film a shot. There was once when I was living in Eugene, they did a movie there, and I remember it took them all day to set this place up with the lights and then when I watched the movie, the scene in that particular spot was only just a few seconds long. So they spent the whole freaking day for just a few seconds. So nothing is left to chance. All right? If someone drives up in a particular truck and parks and it shows you the front end of that truck, so you see the brand name, it's probably product placement. A deal was made. A lot of companies now, in order, because a lot of people are skipping commercial TV and they're going to either cable stations or they're going to just streaming or whatever. So commercials aren't seen. So what they have to do is make sure you still see the product. So, they'll go to a popular TV series and say, why don't you include my brand of truck in your show? And that's product placement. It started with Edward Bernays. He was working for fashion industries, and he had the movie stars dress in the fashions that were representative of the companies he had contracts with. Cigarette companies did this in the old days, have the actors and actresses smoke, so it made it more socially acceptable. But there's other things too. Ever notice that the villain, often you have a plot where small town people are presented as more corrupt than big town people, especially when it comes to law enforcement. How many times does the FBI have to come in and save the day because there's incompetent, corrupt, or just stupid people in small communities trying to solve a bad crime case? That sends a message. It sends a message that you can trust the federal government more than you can trust the local and state governments. Okay? Because they have to come in kind of as a Superman and solve the mysteries. And then you look at the way religious people are presented. My gosh, if I had not been raised at all with religion, and the only image I had was TV, well, on children's programming, you don't see any religion. I mean, it's conspicuous for there being no religion. But let's say I was raised in a family that was like a typical TV show for kids. And of course, there are some reasons why they do that. It's both political, and also many of these networks are making, corporations are making shows that are going to be sent worldwide. So as not to in some way offend the Hindu audience, or the Muslim audience, or the Christian audience, or the Jewish audience, or the whatever audience, you just don't have any references. It's like you whitewash it all, and so you could sell it to everyone. And it goes really deep in that. But again, I could save that for another show. But anyway, if I was raised with no religion, and the only image I had of religion was watching TV, I would probably steer clear of religion altogether, because it's presented so negatively. And I don't mean any kind of arguing like, well, I don't believe in your religion because. No, it's all subtle. It's all, the priest is doing something bad, or the minister is sleeping with his wife's sister, or, things like that. So it's not so much an attack on doctrine, like in the old days, it was usually, well, I disagree with your church because of this. Well, I'm going to counter your arguments with this. No, this is very emotional. If a person has seen 100 times where a minister or a pastor or a preacher, priest, whatever, has been either stupid or corrupt or is some sort of molester or something like that, and then they maybe have 1 out of 100 where they show, him as a good guy, the emotional context has been fed to the people in an emotional propaganda way, in which their feeling is immediately like, whoa, I don't like those people. And that is something that it's hard to counter unless you teach a young person how to spot it. I used to have a psychology professor, and the psychology professor would make it a rule that whenever commercials came on, everyone in the household had to analyze and make fun of that commercial, so it lost control, so it lost its appeal. I think, personally, start off with looking up. There's a bunch of videos out there how to analyze TV programs. You could even get books on the subject. I'm not going to say go get Jung's Signs and Symbols book and stuff like that, because that's for the real hardcore when it comes to understanding film production. Jung's, by the way, is very, very popular amongst even modern day film producers. Many of the archetypes that he had and talked about are employed in film. But you need to find these things out so that when you're youngster, or even yourself, because I'll bet you've watched some stuff where it's like, aha, I know it's the priest because the priest is always the bad guy, which is the way Hollywood presents it now. I'm not going to go into reason why. I'm just going to say it is. And even though other shows take great pains not to, offend religion, shows that are for more adult audiences do tend to often offend religion. And you just sit back and you watch it. It's like someone just kind of smearing something in your face through the TV screen, if you happen to believe in that religion. Here, take this. Like some people used to, I would never recommend it, but some people would be like, oh, my dog went to the bathroom on the floor, I'm going to rub its nose in it. This is what it's being done metaphorically, and you need to understand how it's done, what to look for. And I'm talking about how you do camera angles, how they do the lighting on people. They darken the lighting in order to present the person as a villain. Camera angles will often show the good guy from an angle that makes it look like he or she is taller. Whereas villains are often shorter. They use cats because people either love cats or they hate cats. Dogs, you can either love dogs or they're okay. Okay, most people don't hate dogs. But notice how many times villains use, they have a cat in their lap, as opposed to a dog. Very rarely do you see the villain with a dog, because that elicits emotion. People see a dog, and it's all of a sudden it's like, aww. I remember that scene in Independence Day when the dog, all these people get fried in this subway tunnel. And the dog manages to jump through where the family's, crouched away from where the flame would hit, and it jumps in. It's safe, and everyone in the audience was applauding. All these people just got fried, but the audience is loving the fact that the dog survived. Emotion. You need to find out what is behind how television is set up, how the shows are presented, because otherwise you can talk to your kids till you are exhausted. But if you don't teach them how to spot this stuff, you're very likely letting your kid just sit without any supervision and being emotionally manipulated to believe things that you don't want them to believe, or to be against things that you do believe. And again, subtle. How you can, when you get these techniques down, you can pretty much watch a show and it's just like, oh, this is why they threw this in. It doesn't mean, not every show I don't watch that many TV shows, but there's some I do. There's sometimes things are thrown in that I'm like, well, I'm kind of, not big on that, and I see what they're trying to do and everything. But at least you're less vulnerable to any kind of manipulation if you understand it. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to look up the topic of just how film is, how you can analyze film, how you look at everything from, how the angles are done. You don't have to go so deep. There are, like I said, there's videos out there that will show you examples. I'm not going to show you examples here. I'm only set for audio. But ultimately, you learn how the message is created and conveyed, then the message is no longer as lethal, if it's a message you don't like, to those who are younger and less knowledgeable about how the world is really set up. All right? So again, you're not going to win this battle by just you see something on TV and you're going, I disagree with that, because often maybe that's the main star. The child, be they 5 or 10 or even 15, or even older people, has formed an emotional attachment to that star and their character. So if you say, I don't approve of what she's doing right there, or what he's doing right there, well, it's like if you're watching a James Bond movie and someone came in and said, I think he's too violent. Your initial reaction would be like, whatever, see ya. And that's what your kids will do if you bring up something about any kind of values being promoted. So you need to instill in them. Watch some shows and then just casually, something that's kind of neutral, maybe even casually say, hey, do you know why they've tilted the lens here? Do you know why the person's running from right to left? Oh, do you know why that person there is presented as with wearing a cross around their neck, but also has these traits? Now, it may bug your kids to a degree, but they're going to remember that. Don't do it confrontationally. Don't do it judgmentally. Just subtly bring these things up. It's fun to learn about how these things are incorporated, how messages, non-verbal messages, are conveyed in cinema. Okay, it's a lot of fun. And you'll have fun once you start investigating. And then all of a sudden, you're going to watch a program, and it's going to be like, wow, I understand what they're doing here. All right? So give it a try. It's the best way to safeguard your kids, the best way to instill values that will survive even with this emotional onslaught of things that are designed to eradicate those values. Anyway, that's all the time we have now. I encourage you to tune back in next week for another edition of Unlock the Door Radio here on UCY TV Productions. Take care now.